She was humiliated and forcibly removed from her seat, but only minutes later, the very flight attendant who had subjected her to such treatment found herself facing consequences no one could have foreseen. What unfolded during this flight would not only alter the experience for everyone on board, but would also send shockwaves through the entire airline. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you are watching from today. And if you enjoy captivating stories like this, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more. Ava Carter boarded the aircraft with quiet confidence, her presence drawing subtle attention. She wore a tailored blazer over a sleek dress, her natural curls framing her face effortlessly. In one hand, she carried a polished leather laptop bag, and in the other, her boarding pass. As she walked down the aisle, her calm and collected demeanor suggested a woman who was accustomed to moving through the world with poise. Upon reaching her first-class seat, Ava offered a polite smile to the passenger beside her, then placed her bag in the overhead compartment before settling into her seat. She opened a small notebook, pen in hand, and began jotting down notes with quiet focus, seemingly unaware of the occasional curious glances sent her way. Moments later, Miranda Scott, a flight attendant with a sharp gaze and a sense of authority, moved briskly through the cabin. Her professional demeanor was unwavering until her eyes landed on Ava. Something about Ava's presence gave Miranda pause, though it was not immediately clear why. With her expression tightening, Miranda stepped closer to Ava's seat. "Excuse me," Miranda said, her tone polite but tinged with suspicion. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" Ava looked up, surprised but unbothered, and handed over her pass with a soft smile. "Of course." Miranda examined the ticket and frowned. "This is for first class." Ava's response was calm and assured. "That's correct." Despite the confirmation, Miranda's expression darkened as if trying to reconcile some unspoken doubt. Without further explanation, she returned the boarding pass and walked away, her demeanor suggesting the matter was far from settled. Ava, unfazed, returned to her notes, unaware that Miranda was already whispering to a colleague at the front of the cabin, casting glances in her direction. It was not long before Miranda returned, this time with a more authoritative posture. "Miss Carter, could you please step aside for a moment? There appears to be an issue with your reservation." Ava, though visibly puzzled, remained composed. She gathered her laptop bag and followed Miranda to the galley, all under the curious gaze of the first-class passengers. "I'm going to have to ask you to move to a seat in the main cabin," Miranda said curtly. "There seems to have been a mistake with your booking." Ava's brow furrowed slightly. "That's strange. I booked this seat weeks ago, and my ticket was confirmed. Could you double-check?" Miranda's tone sharpened. "I've already checked. This seat is inappropriate for you. Please move, or I will have to call security." For the first time, a flicker of disbelief crossed Ava's otherwise serene face. Still, without protest, she returned to gather her belongings, now fully aware of the attention she had drawn. Passengers whispered as Ava, escorted by Miranda, made her way toward the economy cabin. Her head was held high, her composure unbroken, but her grip on her laptop bag tightened slightly. In the main cabin, Miranda pointed to a cramped middle seat. Ava placed her bag beneath the seat and sat down silently. As Miranda walked away, Ava gazed out the window, her expression calm, yet her mind raced with thoughts both strategic and resolute. From her bag, Ava retrieved her phone and began typing a message, her fingers moving with precision. When she pressed send, the faintest smile tugged at the corner of her lips, a smile that hinted she was far from powerless in this situation. While the hum of the aircraft engines filled the cabin, the tension around Ava remained thick. A few sympathetic passengers cast glances in her direction, while others avoided eye contact altogether. Ava paid no attention to any of it. Her focus remained on her phone as she scrolled through her contacts and made a quick call. Her voice was low but firm. "It's me. I need a favor. Something happened and I want it addressed immediately. Yes, I'm still on the plane. No need to escalate yet. Just be ready." The call ended as swiftly as it had begun, and Ava placed her phone back into her bag. Her calmness was almost unnerving, the demeanor of someone who already knew the outcome long before the first move had been made. Back in first class, Miranda moved through her duties with a sense of quiet satisfaction, confident she had handled the situation appropriately. Yet a small seed of doubt lingered, a faint discomfort she could not quite place. Meanwhile, Ava was fully in control, her calm exterior masking the quiet storm she had already set in motion. As the flight continued, a younger flight attendant named Clara approached Ava, offering a cup of water. Her voice was soft and hesitant. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" Ava's smile was warm but restrained. "I'm fine, thank you. Just a small misunderstanding." Clara hesitated, sensing there was more to the story. But Ava's quiet confidence left little room for further questions. "Please let me know if you need anything," Clara added gently, before stepping away. Unbeknownst to Miranda, her actions had already triggered consequences that were no longer under her control. Ava leaned back in her seat, gazing out at the clouds, her fingers tapping softly against the armrest, a quiet rhythm of a mind at work. Ava Carter was not the kind of woman to cause a scene, but she was not the kind to be dismissed either. Precision was her weapon of choice, and her plan was already well underway. 7 minutes passed before the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for flying with us today. If there is anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable, please let a crew member know." Ava's eyes flicked toward the front of the plane, her expression unreadable. She opened her notebook once more and wrote a single line before snapping it shut. Whatever her next move was, it was clear she was prepared. The cabin settled into a quiet rhythm, passengers engrossed in books, movies, and quiet conversations. Ava remained still, her calm presence masking the quiet intensity beneath the surface. Meanwhile, Miranda moved through first class with practiced efficiency, believing the matter had been resolved. But the past had not been erased, and it certainly had not been forgotten. Ava leaned forward, unlocked her phone, and typed a brief message. "They'll call soon. Let me know when it's done." She hit send. The glow from the screen briefly illuminated her composed face, her expression unreadable to the passengers around her. But if Miranda had seen it, that subtle smile, sharp, knowing, and utterly confident, would have unsettled her far more than any argument ever could. At the front of the plane, Miranda approached her colleague Dennis, a seasoned flight attendant with decades of experience. "Did you notice that woman I moved earlier?" she asked quietly. Dennis raised an eyebrow. "Which one?" "The one I sent back to economy," Miranda clarified. "She had a first-class ticket, but something about her just didn't sit right with me." Miranda's initial observation was that the passenger seemed out of place, a comment that prompted a skeptical frown from Dennis, who leaned casually against the counter. "Out of place? What exactly do you mean?" Dennis asked. Miranda hesitated, realizing she needed to choose her words carefully. "It was just a gut feeling," she admitted. "Better safe than sorry, right?" Dennis's expression darkened. "A gut feeling is not sufficient justification to relocate a passenger. Did she actually do anything wrong?" "No, but—" Dennis cut her off sharply. "You'd better hope this doesn't backfire. First-class passengers do not appreciate being displaced without cause, and neither does the airline." Before Miranda could respond, the in-flight phone in the galley buzzed. Dennis answered, his expression neutral at first. After a brief exchange, his brow furrowed, and he glanced at Miranda with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "It's for you," he said, holding out the receiver. "They're asking for you by name." Miranda's heart skipped a beat. With A hesitant hand, she took the phone, gripping it tightly. "This is Miranda," she said cautiously. A calm yet authoritative voice responded. "This is the executive office. We have received a direct complaint regarding your treatment of a first-class passenger. Upon landing, you will be required to submit a full incident report. In the meantime, ensure all passengers are treated respectfully and do not alter any further seating arrangements without proper justification." The color drained from Miranda's face as the weight of the directive settled upon her. "Understood," she stammered. "I will handle it appropriately." As she placed the receiver back down, her hand trembled slightly. Dennis watched her closely, his expression unreadable. "What's going on?" he asked. "Nothing," Miranda replied, though the unease in her voice was unmistakable. She cast a glance toward the main cabin, where Ava sat, serene and unbothered. For the first time, Miranda felt a creeping sense of foreboding. Ava, seated calmly with her notebook resting on her lap, appeared oblivious to the phone call. Yet, something about her presence now felt deliberately unsettling. Miranda tried to shake off her discomfort as she resumed her duties, forcing a smile and moving mechanically through the cabin. However, her gaze frequently drifted back toward Ava, whose composed demeanor stood in stark contrast to Miranda's inner turmoil. Meanwhile, Ava reclined comfortably, occasionally glancing at her watch before idly flipping through the in-flight magazine. To the casual observer, she appeared relaxed, completely unfazed by the earlier disruption. Yet beneath that placid surface, every element of her plan was proceeding precisely as she had intended. A few moments later, Clara, one of the other flight attendants, approached Ava with a warm, professional smile, a sharp contrast to Miranda's earlier hostility. "Can I get you anything to drink? Perhaps a snack?" Clara offered politely. Ava returned the smile. "Just water, please." Moments later, Clara returned with a cup of water and a neatly folded napkin, setting them gently on Ava's tray table. "Let me know if you need anything else." Ava's smile softened. "Thank you, Clara," she said, her tone sincere. Clara offered a friendly nod and moved on, leaving Ava alone with her thoughts. From a distance, Miranda observed the exchange, her unease intensifying. The ease and grace with which Ava interacted with Clara stood in stark contrast to the problematic image Miranda had formed in her mind. This discrepancy unsettled her more than she cared to admit. The flight continued at cruising altitude, the low hum of the engines providing an almost meditative background noise. Yet inside Miranda's chest, tension continued to mount. In the galley, Dennis quietly prepared refreshments, casting the occasional glance in her direction. "Everything okay?" he asked. Miranda hesitated before giving a terse nod. "Fine." Dennis didn't believe her. Leaning in, his voice lowered to a near whisper. "Listen, I hope you realize something. You don't mess with the wrong passenger in first class. These people have connections." His words struck a nerve. Who exactly was Ava Carter? And why did Miranda feel like she had made a serious mistake? Meanwhile, Ava's phone vibrated softly in her lap. She glanced at the screen, her expression giving away nothing. The message was short. "All set. They're monitoring." Without hesitation, Ava tucked the phone back into her bag and sipped her water, each movement calm and deliberate. The subtle but unmistakable tension between her and Miranda did not go unnoticed by some observant passengers. Nearby, one man, seated across the aisle from Ava, leaned slightly toward her. "That flight attendant seems to have it out for you," he whispered sympathetically. Ava offered a composed smile. "It's nothing I can't handle," she replied. Softly, the man raised a brow, sensing there was more to the story, but opted not to press further. Ava turned her gaze toward the window, watching the endless expanse of clouds. Outwardly, she remained the picture of tranquility, but internally, satisfaction simmered beneath the surface. Every consequence Miranda was about to face had been deliberately set in motion. Back in first class, Miranda's sense of unease intensified. The minutes seemed to stretch endlessly as the earlier phone call replayed in her mind. She could not escape the sense that something was brewing, something beyond her control. Though the flight remained smooth, the atmosphere within the cabin grew heavier. Miranda's usual confident stride had been replaced by hesitant, nervous glances. She occupied herself by checking seatbelts and distributing drinks, but her mind remained fixated on Ava. Each time her eyes drifted toward the main cabin, Ava was still there, calm, composed, and seemingly in command of the moment. The contrast between her own mounting anxiety and Ava's unshakable serenity was disconcerting. Ava, meanwhile, continued to jot occasional notes in her notebook, her gestures mundane yet purposeful. Nearby passengers sensed the underlying tension, though none dared to speak openly about it. Finally, Dennis approached Miranda in the galley once more, handing her a folded note. "The captain wants to see you," he said quietly. Miranda's pulse quickened. "Why?" Dennis merely shrugged, though his expression carried a subtle trace of disapproval. "Just go." Reluctantly, Miranda made her way toward the cockpit. The door closed behind her, sealing her off from the rest of the cabin. Captain Harris, a seasoned pilot with a calm but commanding presence, turned to face her. His co-pilot acknowledged her briefly before returning to the controls. "Miranda," the captain began, his tone measured. "We've received another call from the executive office." Her stomach sank. "Sir, He raised a hand, silencing. This is serious. The passenger you relocated, Ms. Ava Carter, is not an ordinary passenger. She is directly connected to the airline's board of directors. We have been instructed to ensure she is treated with the highest level of respect for the remainder of the flight." Miranda's mouth went dry. "I didn't know," she said weakly. "I thought... Did you think, or did you assume?" Captain Harris interrupted firmly. "Because from my vantage point it appears you acted without just cause. That is unacceptable." Miranda opened her mouth to defend herself, but no words came. The captain sighed, rubbing his temples. "Here's how this will go. You will return to your duties and ensure there are no further incidents. Upon landing, you will submit a comprehensive report to the ground team. Until then, you are not to approach Miss Carter unless absolutely necessary. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir," Miranda whispered, her face burning with humiliation. Dismissed, Miranda exited the cockpit, her mind racing with the implications of her misjudgment. Miranda returned to the galley, where Dennis cast her a questioning glance. She ignored him, instead seizing a tray of beverages and forcing herself to move through the cabin. Her hands trembled faintly as she poured coffee for a first-class passenger, spilling several drops onto the tray. She muttered a quiet curse under her breath, swiftly wiping the mess away. Meanwhile, in the main cabin, Ava remained composed, every gesture deliberate, every movement measured. As Miranda passed her seat, Ava glanced up, her gaze briefly. Locking with Miranda's, there was no malice in Ava's expression, only a calm certainty, as though she already knew precisely how this would end. Unnerved, Miranda quickened her pace, retreating once more to the galley. For the first time in her career, she felt wholly out of control, a sensation she found both unfamiliar and deeply unsettling. Yet beneath her rising anxiety, an even more troubling realization began to crystallize. She might have just made the most consequential mistake of her professional life. Miranda's steps faltered as she leaned against the galley counter, her breath uneven. She tried to center herself by focusing on routine tasks, but the captain's warning echoed relentlessly in her mind. "She's connected to the board." The words struck with the force of a sudden impact. How had she missed something so critical? Miranda had always trusted her instincts, prided herself on her ability to read passengers, but now those very instincts seemed to have betrayed her. Dennis, still observing her with growing curiosity, broke the silence. "Are you going to tell me what's really going on?" His voice was careful but firm. Miranda hesitated, then exhaled slowly. "The woman I moved, she has ties to the airline's board. The captain just informed me." Dennis straightened, his expression shifting from casual interest to alarm. "The board? You're kidding." "I wish I was," Miranda replied, her face pale. "I had no idea. Something felt off about her." She trailed off, realizing how flimsy her reasoning sounded now. Dennis's posture stiffened, his tone sharpening. What exactly felt off? That she didn't look like a first-class passenger? Miranda didn't answer. She couldn't. Instead, she turned away, pretending to busy herself with inventory. Dennis shook his head in disbelief. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "You judged her, and now you're paying the price." Back in the cabin, Ava glanced discreetly at her watch. The flight had reached its midpoint, yet Ava's calm exterior never wavered. She retrieved her phone from her bag, typed a brief message, "almost time," and returned the device to its place. Every action was precise, controlled, and intentional. Nearby passengers were beginning to notice the peculiar dynamic between Ava and the anxious flight attendant who had earlier displaced her. The man across the aisle leaned toward Ava once more, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you sure you're all right? That flight attendant seemed pretty shaken up." Ava smiled faintly, her tone reassuring yet unwavering. "I appreciate your concern, but everything is under control." The man raised an eyebrow, clearly sensing there was more to the story. Yet something about Ava's quiet confidence dissuaded further questions. At the front of the plane, Miranda continued her rounds, her smile forced and brittle. She cycled through her duties mechanically, but her mind remained fixated on Ava and the growing weight of her misstep. Ava's calmness, that unshakable composure, was perhaps the most unnerving aspect of all. She had never raised her voice, never reacted with hostility, and yet she had somehow taken control of the entire situation without lifting a finger. Just as Miranda returned to the galley to prepare for the next service, the captain's voice filled the cabin via intercom. His announcement was routine, thanking passengers for their business and providing reassurance of an on-time arrival. Yet to Miranda, every word felt like a thinly veiled reminder of her escalating error. She glanced once more toward the main cabin, only to find Ava meeting her gaze directly. Ava offered a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. Not smug, not confrontational, merely a quiet acknowledgement that the balance of power had fully shifted. That single gesture sent a chill down Miranda's spine. Whatever Ava Carter intended, Miranda knew she was no longer in control. And, perhaps more frighteningly, she never had been. Miranda swallowed hard, her palms growing clammy under the weight of Ava's gaze. "Of course," she stammered. "If there's anything else I can do to make this right, please let me know." Ava did not respond immediately. Instead, she leaned back in her seat, studying Miranda with a calm yet analytical expression, as though calculating her next move. The silence stretched uncomfortably, leaving Miranda shifting her weight from foot to foot. Finally, Ava offered a faint smile, not one of reassurance, but of quiet, composed confidence. "I appreciate your effort," Ava said, her voice controlled. "However, I trust the airline will handle this matter appropriately after we land." Miranda's stomach knotted. The mention of the airline was unmistakable, a clear signal that Ava had no intention of simply letting the incident fade. I understand," Miranda murmured, lowering her eyes. "If you need anything else, please don't hesitate to ask." Without waiting for a response, Miranda turned and walked briskly toward the galley, her cheeks burning with humiliation. Her mind raced, replaying every word Ava had spoken and imagining the consequences now spiraling out of her control. Meanwhile, Ava reached for her glass of sparkling water and took a measured sip. Her expression remained impassive, giving away nothing to those around her. To the other passengers, she was the very image of calm professionalism. But within, Ava knew that the balance of power had shifted firmly into her hands. In the galley, Dennis raised an eyebrow as Miranda leaned against the counter, her face pale. "How did it go?" he asked. Miranda shook her head, her voice barely audible. "She's not done. She's going to escalate this." Dennis exhaled sharply, his expression darkening. "I told you, people like her. They don't play games. You should have known better." Miranda offered no reply. She stared blankly at the curtain, separating the galley from the main cabin, her thoughts spiraling. For the first time, it dawned on her that Ava Carter was no ordinary passenger. Ava carried influence, more than Miranda had ever imagined, and now Miranda was facing the consequences of underestimating her. As the flight neared its destination, Ava calmly closed her notebook and returned it to her bag with deliberate care. Sitting tall in her seat, she exuded quiet authority, as if preparing for the next move in a long-anticipated strategy. The gentle hum of hushed passenger conversations drifted around her, but Ava paid them no mind. Her focus remained unwavering. Moments later, the intercom chimed. The captain's voice carried a clear note of authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our descent shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your tray tables are stowed. Cabin crew, prepare for landing." The announcement triggered a flurry of movement. Passengers adjusted seats, fastened belts, and secured loose items. Clara, the flight attendant who had interacted with Ava earlier, returned to her row, offering a polite smile laced with subtle unease. "Is there anything I can get you before we land, Ms. Carter?" Ava shook her head graciously. "Thank you, Clara. You've been very kind." Clara's cheeks flushed at the unexpected compliment. "If you need anything, please don't hesitate to ask." With that, she turned to continue her duties, her smile fading the moment her back was turned. The tension in the cabin was impossible to miss. At the front of the cabin, Miranda busied herself with final landing preparations. Her movements were stiff, mechanical, a thin veneer of professionalism barely masking her escalating anxiety. The captain's firm directive and Ava's quietly potent words replayed in her mind like a haunting refrain. She could feel Dennis's eyes on her, as well as the silent awareness of the rest of the crew, though none dared to speak. As the plane descended through a thin veil of clouds, Ava gazed out the window, watching the cityscape emerge below. One hand rested lightly on the armrest, fingers relaxed and unhurried. Despite the storm Miranda was weathering internally, Ava herself felt entirely at ease. Every moment had unfolded exactly as anticipated, and she was fully prepared for what came. Next, the aircraft touched down smoothly, eliciting a quiet sigh of relief from the passengers. Seatbelts clicked open, and overhead, bins creaked as belongings were retrieved. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythms of disembarkation, a tension hung heavy in the air, especially for Miranda, who was acutely aware that her ordeal was far from over. As the seatbelt sign extinguished, Ava remained seated, her movements deliberate and unrushed. She retrieved her phone, typed a brief message, "We've landed, be ready," then slipped it back into her bag. Glancing toward the front of the cabin, she met Miranda's gaze just long enough to make the flight attendant's stomach twist with dread. The cabin doors opened, allowing the cool air of the jet bridge to spill inside. Passengers disembarked in orderly fashion, exchanging polite farewells with the crew. Miranda stood stiffly by the exit, forcing a smile for each passenger, while her heart pounded relentlessly. Ava made no move to rush. She waited until the aisle had mostly cleared before standing, gathering her belongings with the same quiet precision that had defined her demeanor throughout the flight. As she approached the exit, the remaining crew exchanged knowing glances, each sensing that something consequential was about to unfold. "Thank you for flying with us, Ms. Carter," Miranda said, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts. To sound composed, Ava paused, her expression neutral, but her gaze razor-sharp. "I'm sure we'll be in touch," she replied, her tone coolly professional but carrying undeniable weight. Without further comment, Ava stepped off the plane, leaving Miranda frozen in place. Dennis approached quietly. "You okay?" he asked. Though his tone suggested he already knew the answer, Miranda said nothing, her eyes locked on the jet bridge as though expecting the worst. She was not wrong. Moments later, 2 uniformed security officers stepped into the cabin, their presence demanding instant attention. "Are you Miranda Scott?" one of them asked. Miranda's breath caught in her throat. "Yes," she whispered. "We need you to come with us," the officer said. "We have a few questions regarding an incident on this flight." The color drained from Miranda's face. As reality crashed down upon her, Dennis stood silently watching as the officers escorted her away. The once confident flight attendant now walked with rigid posture, barely holding herself together. As the remaining crew exchanged uncertain glances, Ava stood near the gate in the terminal, phone in hand, watching Miranda's departure with calm detachment. Her message had reached exactly the right people, and now the machinery was fully in motion. Without looking back, Ava turned and walked toward the baggage claim, her steps steady, her purpose clear. The situation had unfolded precisely as intended. The hum of the terminal filled the air, mingling with passengers' whispered speculation. No one approached Ava as she passed, her presence both composed and untouchable. Each step carried the air of someone already 2 steps ahead. Someone who knew, without question, that control had always belonged to her. Miranda's heart sank further. I didn't know at first," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I only found out during the flight." The officer leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable, but his gaze unwavering. "Miss Carter is not only a high-ranking executive affiliated with this airline, but also a significant shareholder. Her formal complaint has already reached the board, and they take allegations of bias and mistreatment extremely seriously." Miranda's face turned ashen. She opened her mouth, desperate to respond, but no words came. The officer continued, his tone growing firmer. "Miss Carter's account has been thoroughly documented, and additional passengers have corroborated her version of events. You are now being given the opportunity to explain your side of the story. However, let me be clear. This incident will not be overlooked." Miranda's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. She longed to defend herself, to justify her actions, but every explanation that came to mind felt hollow even before it left her lips. Deep down, she knew. Her decision had been a snap judgment, one made without merit, and now she was facing consequences far beyond what she could have imagined. Meanwhile, at baggage claim, Ava stood calmly near the carousel, her phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was measured, but it carried an unmistakable finality. "Yes, the security team has taken her in for questioning. Please ensure the board reviews all available footage and passenger statements. I want this handled professionally, but thoroughly." She paused, listening to the response before offering a brief nod. "Thank you, and please send a copy of the final report directly to my office. I want to be certain this never happens again, to me or to anyone else." As the first luggage emerged on the conveyor belt, Ava reached effortlessly for her sleek, black suitcase. Around her, a few passengers who had witnessed the incident now watched her with a mix of curiosity and newfound respect. Ava did not acknowledge them. Her focus remained fixed on what came next. The terminal buzzed with its usual symphony of arrivals and departures, but Ava moved through the crowd with quiet purpose. What had begun as an act of prejudice and humiliation had been swiftly transformed into an opportunity for accountability and meaningful change, and she was far from finished. Back in the sterile holding room, Miranda sat alone, her breathing shallow beneath the weight of her suspension. The officers gave her a moment to collect herself, but the silence felt suffocating, each passing second making it harder to steady her nerves. Finally, she spoke, her voice fragile and uncertain. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she began, her eyes darting anxiously between the officers. "I was just following protocol. I thought she didn't belong in first class." The officer closest to her leaned forward, his expression giving nothing away. "And what exactly made you think that?" Miranda's lips parted, but no answer came. The truth, that her assumption had been shaped by unconscious bias, was a reality too uncomfortable to admit aloud. She didn't act like the others in first class," Miranda stammered. The officers exchanged a brief glance before responding. "Not acting like other passengers is not a valid reason to remove someone from their seat, especially when their ticket was fully paid and properly issued. Did Miss Carter break any rules, violate any policies?" Miranda shook her head, her palms slick with sweat. "No, but—" The officer cut her off. "Then your actions were entirely without cause. Miss Carter was fully within her rights to remain seated, and your decision has placed the airline in a legally and reputationally precarious position." Miranda's heart plummeted as the weight of his words settled over her. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but there was no defense left to give. Every excuse sounded feeble, every justification crumbled under scrutiny. The truth was plain. Her actions had been the product of assumption and prejudice, and now she would pay the price. Outside the terminal, Ava stood at the curb as a sleek black sedan pulled up. The driver, impeccably dressed, stepped out and opened the door with a respectful nod. "Miss Carter." "Thank you, William," Ava said smoothly, sliding into the car with characteristic grace. Inside the vehicle, Ava retrieved her phone and scrolled through her inbox. A new email from the airline's board caught her eye. The message was concise yet firm, outlining the immediate steps the airline would take, a full review of the incident, a revision of employee training policies, and a clear assurance that Miranda's actions would be formally addressed. Ava's lips curved into a faint, satisfied smile. She was not seeking revenge. Her aim was accountability and long overdue change. It was clear progress was already underway. Back at the airport, the officers concluded their questioning. They stood preparing to leave, but one of them offered a final statement that cut through the silence like a blade. "This matter will now be escalated to the airline's disciplinary committee. You will receive formal notification soon. Until then, you are officially suspended from duty." Miranda's stomach dropped as the officers left her alone with the silence and her spiraling thoughts. The career she had built, the authority she had assumed, the confidence she once carried, all of it now reduced to rubble by her own misjudgment. Outside, Ava's car merged smoothly into traffic. She gazed calmly out the window, her mind already turning toward her next steps. The day had been long and exhausting, but Ava felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that she had stood her ground and, in doing so, had set in motion a long-overdue reckoning. Her phone buzzed softly with another message from the board. Confirmation that the disciplinary review would be accompanied by a comprehensive overhaul of staff training on bias and customer treatment. Ava read the message, her response brief and decisive. "Good, let's make sure this never happens again." As the city skyline came into view, Ava leaned back into the seat and exhaled slowly. One chapter was closing, but the larger fight, the fight for a culture shift across the industry, was just beginning. Meanwhile, in the dimly lit employee parking lot, Miranda sat frozen in her car, staring at her trembling hands on the steering wheel. Her phone buzzed. A curt, formal message from Human Resources confirming her disciplinary hearing at 9 a.m. the next morning. Her grip tightened on the wheel as the weight of it all finally settled into place. The hearing wouldn't just determine her employment, it would serve as a public reckoning for her actions, a reminder that no bias, conscious or otherwise, would go unnoticed. As Ava stepped into her office, her assistant handed her a neatly organized folder, the board's initial findings, crew statements, and the first draft of the revised training program. "They're moving quickly," the assistant noted. "They have no choice," Ava replied. "This can't be swept under the rug, not this time." Her assistant hesitated. "Do you think the flight attendant will fight back?" Ava considered the question briefly before responding. "Perhaps," she said quietly. "But this isn't about her anymore. This is about the system that made her believe she could act with impunity. That's the real fight." Her assistant nodded, admiration clear in her expression. "Well, they're definitely paying attention now. You've already made an impact." Ava gave a small, thoughtful smile but said nothing. Real change takes time, she knew, but she had patience, and more importantly, she had resolve. Back inside the parking lot, Miranda finally turned the key in the ignition, her car's engine rumbling to life beneath her trembling hands. The career she thought she knew had been stripped away, leaving only the raw, unflinching truth. Her actions had consequences, and this time there was no escaping them. Miranda stared at the steering wheel, her mind racing. She had spent years building her reputation as a capable and dedicated flight attendant, and now it was all unraveling. She thought about Ava, calm, composed, and untouchable. The realization struck Miranda like a blow. Ava had never lost control of the situation. She had been in charge from the moment Miranda made her first mistake. For the first time, Miranda allowed herself to feel something other than anger or frustration. A deep, gnawing regret settled in her chest. She had underestimated Ava Carter, not just as a passenger, but as a person. And now she was paying the price. As Miranda drove away from the airport, Ava sat in her office, reviewing the documents Maya had given her. Her phone buzzed, a message from the airline's CEO requesting a personal meeting to discuss the incident and next steps. Ava typed a short reply. "I'll make time tomorrow. Let's ensure this is resolved properly." She set her phone down and leaned back in her chair, her mind already moving ahead. The events of the day had been exhausting, but Ava knew they had also opened a door, an opportunity to reshape the culture of an entire organization. And for Ava, that was a fight worth having. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the blinds of Ava's office, casting long shadows across her desk. At exactly 10 a.m., Maya escorted Richard Hale, the airline's CEO, into the room. Richard, a tall man in his late 50s, with silver-streaked hair, carried the polished confidence of corporate leadership. But his movements were tense, his expression carefully measured. "Miss Carter, thank you for agreeing to meet on such short notice." Richard began. Ava shook his hand, her own expression calm but firm. "I appreciate you taking the situation seriously, Mr. Hale. Please have a seat." Richard adjusted his tie. "First, let me express my deepest apologies for what happened on your flight. It was completely unacceptable, and we are committed to ensuring such incidents do not occur again." Ava's gaze didn't waver. "I'm glad to hear that, but apologies alone won't fix the underlying issues. This isn't just about one flight attendant making a poor decision. It's about the culture that allowed her to feel justified in making it." Richard's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "You're absolutely right. That's why we've already begun a full review of our policies and training programs. We're implementing mandatory bias and sensitivity training for all staff and revisiting our internal reporting processes." "It's a start," Ava said, "but it's not enough. I want a clear timeline for these changes along with regular updates and measurable results. Richard hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Of course, we'll provide everything you need. Ava allowed a faint smile. Good. Let's make sure this becomes a turning point, not just a box to check. While Ava's meeting progressed, Miranda sat in a sterile conference room at headquarters, waiting for her disciplinary hearing. The silence was suffocating. A thick file sat in front of her, every action, every complaint, every misstep documented. In brutal detail, when the panel of senior executives entered, their expressions were professional but cold. "Miss Scott," the sharp-featured woman leading the panel began. "We're here to discuss the incident on Flight 287. Miranda's throat was dry. "I understand," she whispered. They walked her through the timeline, asking her to explain her decisions. Her voice faltered at every turn. I thought she was in the wrong seat," Miranda admitted. "I was just trying to follow protocol." The woman's brow arched. "According to records, Miss Carter presented a valid first-class ticket. When did you verify that before asking her to move?" Miranda's palms were damp. I didn't." Silence swallowed the room. One of the other executives, a middle-aged man with glasses, leaned forward. "Miss Scott, our airline has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. Your actions violated that policy and placed the company's reputation at risk. Do you understand the severity of this?" Miranda's voice was barely audible. "I do." Questioning continued, professional but unrelenting. By the end, Miranda felt hollowed out. She already knew the outcome. Her career was over. As Miranda left the building, her uniform felt heavier than ever. She thought again of Ava, the woman who had kept her dignity even as Miranda had tried to strip it away. For the first time, Miranda fully understood the weight of her actions, not just what they cost her career, but what they had done to someone else. Later that afternoon, Ava sat with her tea, reading an email from the airline's board. They were moving fast, eager to show their commitment to reform. Attached was a timeline for new training, complaint processes, and accountability measures. A small but meaningful victory. Her phone buzzed. A message from Maya. "Miranda Scott has been officially terminated. Thought you'd want to know." Ava set her cup down, staring at the message. It didn't bring her joy. It didn't feel like a win. Ava had no interest in revenge. Miranda's firing wasn't the goal. It was just a consequence. What mattered was the bigger picture, a broken system that needed fixing. Ava texted back, "Thanks. Let's keep the focus where it belongs." That evening, Miranda sat in her small apartment, the termination letter beside her. She had spent hours replaying the hearing, searching for some way to justify her actions, but there was none. Her assumptions, rooted in bias, had cost her everything. Her phone lit up with messages from friends and family, sympathy and judgment tangled together. Miranda couldn't respond. She felt alone, isolated in the wreckage of her own making. For years, she had prided herself on being a good employee, a rule follower. But now none of that mattered, because when it truly counted, when it required seeing someone fully without judgment, she had failed. Miranda turned on the television, hoping to distract herself, but the first thing that appeared was a news segment about bias in the workplace. It felt almost intentional, as though the universe itself was demanding that she confront her actions. The segment featured a brief interview with Ava Carter, who spoke with calm confidence about the importance of systemic change and holding organizations accountable. Miranda stared at the screen, her chest tightening. Ava's composed demeanor and articulate words stood in stark contrast to Miranda's own turmoil. For the first time, Miranda didn't see Ava as a problem to manage, or a threat to her career. She saw her as someone who had every right to demand better, for herself and for others. Miranda turned off the television and sat in silence. She couldn't undo what she had done, but maybe, just maybe, she could learn from it. Slowly, she reached for her laptop and began typing an email. It was addressed to the airline's board, but it wasn't about defending herself. Instead, she wrote a heartfelt apology, not just to Ava, but to everyone her actions had harmed. For the first time in days, Miranda felt a flicker of clarity. She couldn't change the past, but she could decide what came next. The following week, Ava received an unexpected email. It had been forwarded to her by the airline's board, with the subject line, "Apology from former staff." Curious, Ava opened it. The message was from Miranda Scott. "Miss Carter, I owe you an apology. My actions on that flight were inexcusable. I made assumptions instead of seeing the facts, and I failed to recognize you for who you are, a valued passenger, and more importantly, a person who deserved respect. My behavior reflected poorly on me and on the airline as a whole. For that, I'm truly sorry." Ava read carefully, noting the tone of genuine regret. Miranda went on to explain how the incident had forced her to reflect deeply on her own biases. She admitted her wrongdoing, expressed her intention to educate herself, and acknowledged the need for change, not just within the airline, but across the industry. "This experience has been humbling," Miranda wrote, "and it made me realize just how necessary the changes you've been advocating for truly are. I hope my actions, as wrong as they were, can serve as an example of why change is needed. I'm committed to learning from this and ensuring I never make the same mistake again. Thank you for holding me accountable." Ava leaned back in her chair, letting the words settle. She wasn't naive. Apologies often came more from guilt than genuine change. But there was something about this one that felt different. After a moment, Ava drafted a brief response. "Thank you for your message. Accountability is the first step toward growth. I hope you continue on this path and use this experience to create real, lasting change." She hit send and closed her laptop, turning to the window. For Ava, this was never just about personal justice. It was about starting a ripple, one that could shift the culture itself. In the weeks that followed, that ripple began to spread. The airline announced a new series of mandatory bias and sensitivity training for all staff. The statement, made public, acknowledged the need for accountability. Ava's role wasn't overemphasized, but it was acknowledged with respect, not as an agitator, but as a catalyst for progress. The changes sparked wider conversations across the aviation industry. Other airlines began reviewing their own policies, with some even reaching out to Ava directly for advice. She declined most offers, choosing to focus on ensuring that the reforms within her own case were fully realized. This was never about personal attention. It was about real, structural change. One afternoon, Ava found herself back at the airport, preparing to board a flight for a business meeting. As she approached the gate, she sensed something had shifted. Staff greeted passengers warmly, their smiles more genuine. Questions were answered with patience and care. It wasn't perfect. No system ever is. But it was undeniably better. And that was a start. At the gate, the agent recognized her immediately. "Miss Carter, welcome back. We've upgraded your seat as a small token of our appreciation for your continued advocacy." Ava smiled, waving it off politely. "That's kind of you, but I'm fine where I am." As she stepped onto the plane, Ava noticed it again. The crew seemed more engaged, more present. Across the aisle, a young woman struggled to fit her bag into the overhead compartment. Almost instinctively, a flight attendant stepped forward, offering help with a kind smile and reassuring tone. Ava's gaze drifted toward the front of the cabin, where Clara, the attendant who had shown her compassion during her ordeal, stood supervising the boarding process. Thanks to Ava's testimony, Clara had been promoted to a senior role. Their eyes met, and Clara gave a small, grateful smile. Ava returned it, a silent exchange of respect and understanding. Moments like this were why Ava had fought so hard. Small gestures, multiplied over time, could change a culture. As the plane took off, Ava leaned back in her seat, reflecting on the journey, not just this flight, but everything that had followed. She thought about Miranda's apology, the reforms, and the unexpected messages of support from strangers who had heard her story. It was humbling, but also deeply empowering. Somewhere across the city, Miranda was beginning her own journey. She had taken a job with a non-profit focused on workplace equity, using her personal failure as a case study for training and education. It wasn't easy, and Miranda knew she had much to prove. But for the first time, her work wasn't about climbing a corporate ladder. It was about something bigger. At 30,000 feet, Ava opened her notebook and wrote a single line. Change begins with accountability, but it thrives on persistence. Closing the notebook, she gazed out at the clouds, feeling, for the first time in a long while, at peace. The fight wasn't over. There was still so much work to do. But as Ava watched the skies stretch endlessly before her, she felt something unexpected, hope. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this one. See you in the next video.